You're all uniformed killers." The words echoed through the international airport terminal, causing several heads to turn. Helen Matthews, a 52-year-old university professor, was in the middle of a heated argument with an airline employee who was attempting to explain why military personnel were given priority boarding. Her face was red with indignation, and her hands trembled as she nervously adjusted her thick-framed glasses. "Ma'am, please calm down," the employee pleaded, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. "It's just a courtesy for—" "Courtesy?" Helen interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what we're calling institutionalized privilege now?" Around her, other passengers watched the scene unfold, their expressions a mix of discomfort and disapproval. Helen didn't care. As a sociology professor for over 2 decades, she had built her academic reputation on criticizing what she referred to as the militarization of American society. Her publications and lectures frequently attacked what she saw as a blind reverence for militarism. By the time she finally boarded, her mood was thoroughly ruined. Dragging her carry-on down the narrow aisle, Helen reached seat 14C, only to discover that her travel companion would be precisely what irritated her most at that moment: a young soldier in military uniform. "Excuse me, ma'am. I believe this is my seat," he said politely, gesturing to 14D by the window. His voice was soft and measured, which only served to further aggravate Helen. She stood with an exaggerated sigh, making a point of displaying her displeasure. The soldier appeared no older than 25, his uniform neatly pressed and his posture upright. Helen watched him stow a battered backpack in the overhead compartment, noticing the name tag on his uniform. "Anderson? I suppose you're enjoying all this special treatment," Helen remarked acidly as he sat down. "Must be comforting to be treated like a hero just for wearing that uniform." Anderson turned to her slowly, his brown eyes radiating a calmness that starkly contrasted with Helen's hostility. There was something in his gaze that she couldn't quite decipher, a depth that didn't align with her assumptions about cocky young soldiers. "Actually, ma'am, I'd prefer to go unnoticed," he replied quietly. "I'm just trying to get home." A flight attendant approached, offering Anderson a bottle of water. Helen rolled her eyes dramatically. "See? This is exactly what I talk about in my lectures. This blind worship of militarism is a symptom of a sick society." "You seem to hold very strong opinions about people you don't even know," Anderson observed, maintaining his polite tone. "Maybe we could have a more constructive conversation if—" "Constructive conversation?" Helen interrupted, slipping into her professor persona. "Have you ever critically examined the system you're a part of? Have you questioned why young people like you are used as pawns in power games?" The plane began taxiing, and a sudden jolt of turbulence shook the cabin. Helen noticed something that her initial anger had obscured. Anderson's hands were trembling slightly, and some color had drained from his face. "Are you all right?" she asked, more out of reflex than genuine concern. Anderson took a deep breath before replying. "I'm not a big fan of flying since my last mission." His voice faltered slightly on the last word. It was then Helen noticed other details her fury had blinded her to: a small scar near his temple, partially hidden by his close-cropped hair, and the subtle tremor in his hands that he seemed to be trying to suppress. "Last mission?" she asked, her tone softening just a bit. Anderson closed his eyes for a moment as if summoning courage. "I'm coming back from rehab. I spent the last 8 months there after our helicopter was shot down during a humanitarian rescue mission. We were evacuating civilians from a natural disaster zone when we were hit." Helen felt her throat tighten. "Natural disaster?" "A devastating earthquake," Anderson continued, his voice now barely a whisper. "There were families trapped, children in urgent need of medical care. In that moment we were their only hope. Mike, my best friend since basic training, was piloting. He didn't manage to eject in time." The silence that followed was deafening. Helen felt as though all the air had been sucked out of the cabin. Her certainties and snap judgments began to crumble under the weight of the raw human reality before her. "We lost 3 men that day," Anderson continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And you know what's worse? It wasn't enemy bullets or terrorists that took us down. It was a mechanical failure. Something as mundane as a defective part turned a rescue mission into a tragedy." Helen watched as a solitary tear traced its way down the soldier's face, which he quickly wiped away. Her academic theories and social critiques seemed hollow and distant in the face of the young man's palpable pain. "I'm wearing this uniform today because I'm heading straight from the airport to Mike's funeral," Anderson explained, nervously adjusting his tie. "After 8 months of surgeries and physical therapy, I finally got medical clearance to travel." But I was too late to say goodbye to him in the hospital. Guilt began gnawing at Helen. She, who so often preached against prejudice and sweeping generalizations in her lectures, was now being confronted by her own biases. The uniform she had once found so offensive now seemed to tell a different story, not one of military glorification but of sacrifice, loss, and humanity. I'm sorry, she murmured, feeling the weight of her earlier words. I was deeply unfair to you. Anderson offered a sad smile. No need to apologize, ma'am. We all carry our own battles and perspectives. What matters is being willing to listen and understand the other side of the story. The rest of the flight passed in reflective silence. With every bit of turbulence, Helen noticed how Anderson gripped the armrests, fighting memories she could only begin to imagine. Her own convictions, once so solid and unquestionable, now felt fragile and superficial. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Helen realized she was experiencing one of the most profound lessons of her life, not one found in academic books or social theories, but in the raw reality of human complexity. It was a humbling reminder that, in her intellectual arrogance, she had oversimplified something as intricate as the human experience. The gentle touch of the wheels on the runway brought Helen back to the present. Beside her, Anderson exhaled deeply, clearly relieved to have his feet back on solid ground. She realized that something within her had landed as well, a new understanding of the importance of looking beyond appearances and the labels we so easily assign to others. As the passengers began standing up and collecting their belongings, Helen remained seated, still processing the intensity of the conversation she had just had. Anderson rose slowly, his movements clearly cautious, revealing a physical pain he was trying to conceal. "Let me help you with your backpack," Helen offered, feeling compelled to do something, anything, to make up for her earlier behavior. "That's not necessary, ma'am," Anderson replied politely, but a grimace of pain crossed his face as he reached for the overhead compartment. Ignoring his protests, Helen stood up and grabbed the worn backpack before he could stop her. That's when she noticed its surprising weight. It wasn't just an ordinary bag, there was something more substantial inside. "They're Mike's medals," Anderson explained, noticing her curious glance. "His family asked me to bring them to the ceremony. He earned the last one, posthumously." The word posthumously hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Helen felt a lump form in her throat as she handed the backpack to Anderson. Her fingers briefly brushed against his, and she noticed the small scars on the young soldier's hands, silent evidence of the trials he had endured. "Anderson," she began hesitantly, "I know I have no right to ask this, but would you mind if I attended the funeral? I'd like to pay my respects to your friend." Anderson paused, clearly taken aback by her request. His eyes studied Helen's face, searching for any hint of insincerity or condescension. Instead, he found only genuine regret and a sincere desire to understand. "His name was Michael Sullivan," Anderson said at last, his voice soft. "Mike always said the more people knew his story, the longer he'd live through them. I think he'd want you there." As they walked together through the airport terminal, Helen noticed how Anderson shifted between moments of military composure and fleeting glimpses of vulnerability. Every step seemed to cause him discomfort, though he worked hard to maintain his posture. "The ceremony is at Memorial Cemetery in 2 hours," he informed her as they neared the exit. "I'm heading home first to get myself ready." Helen nodded, understanding his need for a private moment. They exchanged phone numbers and she promised to meet him at the cemetery. As she watched him walk away, Helen felt a weight settle on her shoulders. Her entire academic career had been devoted to theorizing about people she had never truly known. In the taxi to her hotel, Helen couldn't stop reflecting on how quickly she had judged Anderson. Her phone buzzed with a message from her university assistant. A reminder of the lecture she was scheduled to give the following week titled, "The Militarization of Civil Society." The title now struck her as bitter, almost offensive. At the hotel, Helen changed into a modest black dress. As she adjusted her appearance in the mirror, her reflection seemed to accuse her silently. How many times had she done exactly what she criticized in her lectures? Judging people based on preconceived notions and stereotypes. The Memorial Cemetery was a serene place, its ancient trees casting gentle shade over rows of perfectly aligned headstones. Helen arrived a few minutes early and immediately noticed the small group gathered near a freshly prepared plot. Anderson was there, now wearing his full dress uniform, the medals on his chest glinting in the afternoon sun. Beside him stood a middle-aged woman clutching a framed portrait, Michael's mother, Helen assumed. Her red, swollen eyes told a story of pain that no words could ever fully capture. As Helen approached, Anderson introduced her to Michael's family. "This is Dr. Matthews," he said simply. "She's here to honor Mike's memory." Michael's mother, Sarah Sullivan, took Helen's hand with surprising strength. "Did you know my son?" she asked, her eyes searching desperately for another connection to her lost child. Helen's heart tightened. "No, Mrs. Sullivan. But today I've learned about the kind of man he was through the eyes of his friend." Sarah nodded, silent tears streaming down her face. "Mike and David," she said, glancing at Anderson, "were like brothers. From the first day of training they always looked out for each other." The ceremony began, and Helen stood in solemn silence as military honors were rendered. The sound of rifle fire pierced the air 3 times, causing Anderson to flinch visibly. Helen noticed how he tightly shut his eyes with each volley, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. When Anderson was called to deliver the eulogy, he walked to the podium with evident difficulty, but his voice was steady as he began to speak. "Mike Sullivan wasn't just my best friend," he started. "He was the kind of person who made you want to be better. When our helicopter was hit, his final act was trying to stabilize the aircraft so the rest of us could eject. He saved lives until his very last moment." Anderson's voice faltered, and he had to pause to gather himself. Helen felt tears streaming down her own face, moved by the depth of the bond between these men, a bond she had so easily dismissed just hours earlier. "But Mike wasn't just a hero," Anderson continued. "He was a devoted son, a caring brother, and the most loyal friend anyone could ever ask for. He loved country music even when we all told him his taste was terrible. And he always saved the last M&Ms in the bag to share, because he said candy tasted better when shared with friends." These small glimpses into Michael's humanity hit Helen deeply, driving home the gravity of her earlier misconceptions. Each person in uniform had a story, dreams, loved ones who cherished them and whom they cherished in return. They weren't symbols or statistics. They were complex human beings with rich lives filled with experiences and relationships. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Helen remained by Anderson's side. He stood motionless, staring at the flag-draped casket. "He'd be the first to laugh at all this, you know?" Anderson said quietly. "Mike always said people needed to learn to look beyond appearances. He used to joke that one day, I'd meet someone who'd completely change my perspective on life." Helen felt the weight of his words. "I think today it was the other way around," she replied. "You changed mine." For the first time Anderson smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. Mike would have loved that even more. Sarah Sullivan approached them, still clutching her son's portrait. "David," she said softly, "I'd like you to have this." She held out a chain bearing Michael's dog tags. Anderson accepted them with trembling hands, holding them as if they were the most precious thing in the world. Helen watched as he ran his fingers over the engraved letters, his eyes closing in silent prayer. It was at that moment that Helen realized how her academic life, her theories, and her lectures had created a barrier between her and the human reality she aimed to analyze. The real learning wasn't in books or classrooms, but right there in the cemetery, witnessing the love, loss, and real courage of the people she had judged so hastily. After the funeral, Helen couldn't shake the images from the ceremony. In her hotel room, she tried to work on her upcoming lecture, but the words on her laptop felt empty and superficial. The file that was open contained her notes on the glorification of war in modern society, a topic that now made her feel deeply uncomfortable. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Anderson, still in his dress uniform, looking exhausted but determined. "Sorry to show up unannounced, Dr. Matthews," he said, his voice hoarse. "But after the ceremony I realized I needed to share something with you. Something that might help you understand why your words on the plane affected me so much." Helen invited him in, noticing how he limped more noticeably now, no longer trying to hide it. Anderson sat down in an armchair, pulling a crumpled envelope from the inside pocket of his uniform. "This is the last letter Mike wrote me," he began, his hands trembling slightly as he held the paper. "He sent it 3 days before the accident. I never showed it to anyone, not even his family." Helen sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the moment. Anderson started reading. "Dave, brother. If you're reading this, something probably went wrong. You know how paranoid I am about these things, so I decided to write this just in case. There's something you need to know, something I've been keeping to myself for a long time." Anderson paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. The letter goes on to reveal that Mike had uncovered irregularities within our unit. Some senior officers had been diverting resources meant for equipment maintenance, including spare parts for the helicopters. Helen felt her stomach churn. "So, the accident?" It wasn't just a random mechanical failure, Anderson finished, his voice heavy with bitterness. It was the result of negligence and corruption. Mike had been gathering evidence, planning to expose it through the proper channels. He died before he could. The silence that followed was thick, laden with implications. Helen realized that her simplistic view of the military as a monolithic entity was being shattered. The reality was far more complex and nuanced than she had ever considered. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. Anderson folded the letter carefully before answering. "Because you need to understand that we also fight against injustices within the system. Mike didn't die fighting an external enemy, he was a victim of the same institutional corruption that you criticize in your lectures." He stood up with difficulty and walked over to the window. "But you know what's ironic? Even knowing all of this, Mike never lost faith in the importance of what we did. He used to say that the uniform doesn't represent a perfect institution, but a commitment to something greater than ourselves." Helen watched the way the evening light illuminated the medals on his uniform. "And you, Anderson? What do you think of all this?" "I think Mike was right," he replied, turning to face her. "And I think I'm going to continue what he started. That's why I came back even after everything. Not for the uniform or the institution, but for what it represents, the possibility of change from within." It was then that Helen noticed something different in Anderson, a fierce determination behind his apparent calm. "Are you going to expose the wrongdoing?" "I've already started," he replied, pulling a USB drive from his pocket. Mike wasn't alone in his investigation. Other soldiers, good people who care about the truth, were helping. "We managed to gather all the evidence he had collected, plus some new ones." Helen felt a chill run down her spine. "Isn't this dangerous?" Anderson smiled sadly. "Anything worth fighting for has its risks, Dr. Matthews. Mike taught me that. But I need help, someone with academic credibility, someone who can give this story a voice in a way that can't be ignored or suppressed." The unspoken request hung in the air between them. Helen realized she was standing at a crossroads in her career, and in her life. Everything she had written and taught about military institutions was about to be challenged, not by theories, but by hard evidence of corruption and the struggle of brave people against it. "Anderson," she began, choosing her words carefully, "what exactly are you asking of me?" "I'm asking you to use your voice, Dr. Matthews. Not to blindly attack or defend, but to tell the truth, all of it. About the men and women who wear this uniform, not because they are fanatics or blind followers, but because they believe they can make a difference." Helen stood up and walked over to her desk, where her laptop still showed the draft of her lecture. With one click, she deleted the entire file. "Tell me everything," she finally said. "From the beginning?" Anderson nodded, sitting back down. "It started about a year ago when Mike noticed discrepancies in the maintenance records. The next few hours were filled with shocking revelations. Anderson showed documents, photos, financial records. A complex scheme of resource embezzlement that had cost not only money but lives. As the night wore on, Helen realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just a corruption expose, but a testament to the moral courage that transcended uniforms and ideologies. Anderson wasn't just a wounded soldier seeking justice. He was a man determined to honor his friend's sacrifice in the only way he could, exposing the truth that had cost Mike his life. "There's one more thing you need to know," Anderson said as it was well past midnight. "The reason I'm entrusting this information to you specifically." He pulled out another document from the envelope, this one older and worn. "Mike did research on you, Dr. Matthews. He admired your work, even though he disagreed with some of your conclusions. He used to say that you were someone who, despite your biases, always sought the truth." Helen took the document with trembling hands. It was an article she had written 15 years ago, where she had exposed a corruption scheme in a large corporation. The handwritten notes in the margins, written by Mike, showed a deep and respectful analysis of her methodology. "He believed that one day our paths would cross," Anderson continued, his voice choked with emotion. "He said that when that happened, I would know you were the right person to help tell the story." Helen felt tears stream down her face. The weight of the trust being placed in her, the responsibility to honor not just Mike's memory but also the truth he had died trying to reveal, was overwhelming. Helen held the marked article, her fingers tracing Mike's meticulous annotations. Her own words, written so long ago, now returned with new meaning. In the margins, Mike had written, "Solid methodology. Unique perspective on institutional corruption. Potential ally for systemic change." Mike also left this, Anderson said, pulling out a small notebook from his backpack. "These are his journals from the last few months. He documented everything. suspicious conversations, discrepancies in the records, even photos of defective parts that were logged as new in the official documents. Helen flipped through the notebook, her stomach churning as she read the last notes, dated just 2 days before the accident. I confirmed today, all parts from batch 247 were counterfeit. Documents show quality certification, but they're clearly remanufactured. DA said that 3 more helicopters received these parts. We need to act fast. DA? Helen asked, her voice trembling. Daniel Armstrong, Anderson explained, his expression darkening. He was our maintenance officer. He was found dead in his apartment a week after the accident. The official investigation concluded it was a suicide. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. You don't believe that? Armstrong had 3 young children and was about to retire, Anderson replied, his voice thick with bitterness. He left a letter confessing negligence in the maintenance procedures, taking all the blame. Very convenient for some people. Anderson rose again, walking with difficulty to his backpack. From it he pulled out a thick folder filled with documents. This is everything we've gathered so far, he explained, spreading the papers across the table. Falsified records, altered invoices, photographs of defective parts. But the most important are these. He separated a few specific documents, emails exchanged between senior officers discussing alternative maintenance procedures and creative solutions for budget problems. The scheme is bigger than we initially thought, Anderson continued. It's not just a few defective parts. It's an entire system of resource diversion affecting multiple bases and units. Mike estimated that at least 30% of the maintenance budget was being siphoned off. Helen reviewed the documents, her academic training identifying patterns and connections. This explains why you needed someone from the academic field, she said slowly. You need someone who can analyze this data systematically, establish correlations, and someone who can publish the findings in a way that can't be ignored, Anderson completed. Mike always said that real change needs to come from both inside and outside the system. Helen leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the responsibility she was about to take on. Anderson, do you understand the risks involved? For you, for your career, for your life? Anderson smiled sadly. Dr. Matthews, ever since I woke up in that hospital, knowing Mike hadn't made it, my life hasn't been the same. Every step I take with this injured leg, every nightmare about the crash, all of it reminds me of the cost of silence. He picked up Mike's identification plates, now carrying them alongside his own. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Because other lives can't be lost because of greed and corruption. Helen looked back at her laptop, where just a few hours ago, her draft had criticized the military institution. Now she realized how limited her perspective had been, how she had failed to see the nuances and complexities of the situation. I'll need time, she said finally, to analyze all of this properly, to establish connections, to build a solid case. Time is something we may not have much of, Anderson interrupted, his voice urgent. Since I started asking questions about the accident, I've noticed strange things. Mysterious calls, people following me. As if to confirm his words, a car slowly passed below the hotel window, its lights off despite the darkness of the night. Anderson instinctively moved away from the window. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover up the evidence, he continued. We've already lost some important documents when Armstrong's office was cleaned out after his death. Helen felt the weight of urgency in his words. She stood up, walking over to her suitcase, from which she pulled out an external hard drive. Let's start now, she said with determination. I'll copy everything, create secure backups. We can work through the night, organize the evidence, establish a timeline. Anderson nodded, visibly relieved. Mike was right about you, he said softly. He always said that behind all your criticism of militarism, there was someone who truly cared about truth and justice. As they worked through the night, organizing documents and connecting evidence, Helen felt a profound transformation happening within her. Her academic certainties, her theories about militarism and institutional power, were being reshaped by the raw reality unfolding before her. It was no longer about critiquing or defending the military system as a whole. It was about exposing the truth, honoring the sacrifice of those who died trying to do the right thing, giving a voice to those who risked everything to fight corruption from within. When the sun began to rise, Helen and Anderson had created a detailed timeline of events, identified the key players involved, and established clear connections between the misappropriation of resources and multiple unexplained accidents over the past few years. This is going to change a lot of lives, Helen said, looking at the mass of organized documents before them. "It's already changed hours," Anderson replied simply. The morning sun found Helen and Anderson still hunched over the documents in their hotel room. Empty coffee cups piled up on the table, silent witnesses to a sleepless night. Helen massaged her temples, trying to mentally organize the avalanche of information they had processed over the past few hours. "We need to be strategic about this," she said, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed her notes. "If we just publish everything at once, they might try to discredit the evidence or worse." A sudden sound in the hallway made Anderson jump to his feet, his military instinct clear in the way he positioned himself between the door and Helen. After a few tense seconds, it became clear that it was just a hotel employee making his morning rounds. "Sorry," he muttered, relaxing slightly. "I think I'm a little paranoid." "Rightfully so," Helen replied, recalling the suspicious car from the night before. "The deeper we get into this, the more I realize how much you're all risking." Anderson hobbled to the window, looking out at the still quiet street below. "Mike used to say the biggest risk is doing nothing when you know something's wrong." Helen was about to respond when her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "We know what you're doing. Stop while you still can." She showed the message to Anderson, who immediately started collecting the scattered documents. "We need to get out of here. Now." "Wait," Helen said, her heart racing but her mind working quickly. "They want to scare us make a mistake. We need to be smarter than that." She grabbed her laptop and began typing quickly. "I have a contact in the university's investigative journalism department. Sarah Jenkins. She has experience with military whistleblower cases and connections to several reputable media outlets. Can we trust her?" Anderson asked, still alert. "She was my student years ago. She built her career exposing corporate and government corruption. And more importantly, she knows how to protect her sources." Helen sent a carefully coded email to Sarah, using old references that only they would understand. As they waited for a response, Anderson continued organizing the documents, sorting them into categories based on their importance and sensitivity. "We need a plan B," he said, stowing the most crucial evidence in his backpack. "If something happens to me?" "Don't talk like that," Helen interrupted sharply, surprising herself with the intensity of her reaction. In less than 24 hours, this young soldier, whom she had judged so hastily, had become someone she deeply cared about. "It's necessary," Anderson gently insisted. "Promise me that if something happens you'll keep going. The truth needs to come out, no matter the cost." Helen's laptop made a sound. Sarah had replied quickly, "Meeting in an hour. Safe location. Sent coordinates." The coordinates led to a small cafe in the suburbs, away from the busy city center. Helen and Anderson decided to take separate routes there, her by taxi, him by bus, to minimize the risk of being followed. During the journey, Helen couldn't stop thinking about how drastically her life had changed in the last 24 hours. From an academic criticizing militarism from her ivory tower, she had become part of something much bigger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The cafe was a discreet establishment, with old black and white photographs decorating the walls and soft jazz music playing in the background. Sarah was already there when Helen arrived, sitting in a corner, her gray hair and reading glasses giving her an innocuous appearance that masked her formidable reputation as an investigative journalist. "Professor Matthews," Sarah greeted her with a restrained smile. "When I received your email, I could hardly believe it. You've always been so critical of military issues." "Things have changed," Helen replied simply, sitting down. "Or rather, my understanding has changed." Anderson arrived a few minutes later, his military uniform replaced with civilian clothes that made him look even younger. Sarah watched him carefully as he introduced himself, her experienced eyes assessing his sincerity. For the next 2 hours, they shared with Sarah the details of Mike's investigation, the evidence collected, and the suspicions about Armstrong's death. The journalist took meticulous notes, occasionally asking probing questions that demonstrated her expertise in similar cases. "This is pure dynamite," she said finally, closing her notebook. "But you're right to be cautious. Cases like this have cost lives before." "What do you suggest?" Helen asked, aware of the weight of the decisions they needed to make. "First, we need to back everything up, distribute copies to different locations with trusted people. Second, we'll build the story gradually, starting with the less sensitive but still important aspects." Anderson nodded, recognizing the wisdom in the approach. "Like the discrepancies in the less critical maintenance records?" "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "We establish a pattern of irregularities before revealing the more serious connections to the accidents and deaths. As they discussed strategies, Helen noticed two men entering the cafe. Something about their behavior, the way they scanned the room, how they positioned themselves near the exit, set off an alarm in her mind. Anderson also noticed. Without drawing attention, he slid a USB drive to Sarah under the table. "Everything is here. If you don't hear from us in the next 24 hours, I know what to do," Sarah completed, discreetly tucking the device away. The men began to move in their direction. Sarah casually stood up, as if she were simply finishing coffee with friends. "Keep in touch through the channel we set up. And be careful, both of you." Helen and Anderson stayed seated, pretending to continue a casual conversation while Sarah left. The men seemed to hesitate, clearly unsure of who to follow. Finally, one of them exited behind Sarah while the other stayed in the cafe. "She knows how to shake off tailors," Anderson whispered, trying to reassure Helen, who had visibly paled. Mike checked her out thoroughly before considering her as a contact. "What do we do now?" Helen asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We act normal. We leave separately. You go back to the hotel, check out, and head to the airport as planned. I have some contacts I need to check here in the city." "No," Helen said firmly, surprising herself. "I'm not letting you handle this alone." Anderson looked at her with a mix of gratitude and concern. "Dr. Matthews?" "Helen," she corrected him. "After all this, I think you can call me Helen." A small smile appeared on Anderson's tired face. "Helen, you're already risking so much just by being involved. Your position at the university, your reputation?" "A reputation built on premises I'm beginning to seriously question," she interrupted. "Besides, you yourself said, the truth needs to come to light no matter the cost." The man who had remained in the cafe ordered a coffee, his eyes occasionally drifting toward their table. Anderson checked his watch. "We need to get out of here," he said softly. "But we need to be smart about it." Helen nodded, her heart pounding, but her determination unwavering. In less than a day, she had gone from a critical observer to an active participant in the fight for justice. And, surprisingly, she felt no regret, only an increasing certainty that she was finally on the right side of history. Helen and Anderson left the cafe separately, taking different paths to throw off any potential followers. The plan was to meet in 1 hour at the public library, a busy location where it would be harder to be approached without drawing attention. On her way there, Helen couldn't stop thinking about how her life had turned into something straight out of a conspiracy thriller. She, who had spent years criticizing the military complex from the comfort of her academic position, was now caught in the middle of a dangerous investigation into corruption and covered-up deaths. When she arrived at the library, Helen chose a table on the second floor, near an emergency exit as Anderson had instructed. She pretended to be absorbed in a book while discreetly watching the people around her. 40 minutes passed, and Anderson had not shown up. Her phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number: "Change of plans. Meet me in the Memorial Park parking lot in 15 minutes. It's urgent." Something in the tone of the message felt off. Anderson had always been meticulous in his plans, and a sudden change of location went against everything they had discussed about safety. Helen decided to call the number he had used earlier. After 3 rings, an unfamiliar voice answered. "Hello, Professor Matthews. I imagine you're looking for your soldier friend?" Helen's blood ran cold. "Who are you? Where is Anderson?" "Sergeant Anderson is indisposed at the moment. But don't worry, he's alive. For now." The voice was calm, almost professional. "I suggest you come to the address I'm going to send. Alone, of course. And bring all the documents." "How do I know he's really with you?" There was a moment of silence, then Anderson's voice, weak but determined. "Helen, don't come. It's not worth it." The sound of a blow interrupted his words, making Helen swallow hard. "You have 1 hour," the first voice returned. "And don't try anything stupid. We already know about the journalist, but she's a problem for another time." The call ended, and seconds later Helen received a message with an address: an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Her hands trembled as she considered her options. Calling the police was out of the question. They didn't know who to trust, and Anderson had made it clear that there were suspicions of authorities being involved in the scheme. Sarah was being followed and likely couldn't help without compromising the evidence she was carrying. It was then that Helen remembered something she had noticed in the documents during the night. A name that appeared repeatedly in the suspicious communications: Colonel Richard Harrison. He was listed as one of the main suspects in Mike's investigation, but something in the later reports had caught her attention. Hastily returning to the hotel, Helen retrieved her notes. Yes, there it was. Harrison had been abruptly transferred to another unit shortly after the accident, but not before trying to initiate an internal investigation that was quickly suppressed. With trembling hands, Helen quickly searched online. Harrison now worked in a nearby administrative office, having been effectively sidelined after his transfer. It was risky, but it could be her only chance. Taking a taxi, Helen headed to Harrison's office address. During the ride, she couldn't stop thinking about Anderson. How he had transformed her worldview in less than 2 days, how his courage in seeking the truth had awakened something inside her that she didn't know existed. Harrison's office was modest, almost hidden at the end of a quiet hallway. The sign on the door simply read "Administration." Helen knocked, her heart pounding in her chest. "Come in," a deep voice replied. The man behind the desk was younger than Helen had expected, though his graying hair and tired eyes spoke of experiences that aged the soul more than the body. Harrison lifted his eyes from the papers he was reading, his expression initially neutral but turning into something more complex when he recognized Helen's name. "Dr. Matthews? The academic who writes against militarism?" There was a note of irony in his voice. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Colonel Harrison, I don't have much time. I need your help. It's about Michael Sullivan and David Anderson." The mention of Mike made Harrison straighten in his chair, any pretense of casualness disappearing from his face. "Close the door," he said quickly. In the next few minutes, Helen explained the situation. Mike's investigation, Anderson's discoveries, the kidnapping. Harrison listened in silence, his face growing darker with each passing moment. "So they finally made their move," he murmured, more to himself than to Helen. "I've been waiting for this since I tried to investigate Sullivan's accident." "So you knew?" Harrison stood up, walking over to a locked filing cabinet in the corner of the room. "I knew enough to be dangerous but not enough to act. Sullivan had contacted me a few weeks before the accident, but before we could meet..." He opened a drawer, pulling out a thick folder. "I have my own evidence. Things I've collected over the years, waiting for the right moment. But I needed something more concrete, something that would connect all the dots. Like the documents Mike and Anderson gathered," Helen finished. "Exactly." Harrison checked his watch. "How much time do we have?" "Less than half an hour until the deadline they gave." Harrison grabbed his phone, dialing a number quickly. "Johnson? It's Harrison. Remember that favor you owe me? I need it now." After a brief conversation in code that Helen couldn't fully understand, Harrison turned back to her. "I have some trusted men, people who were sidelined or transferred like me for asking too many questions. We've kept in touch, waiting for an opportunity. Are you going to help rescue Anderson?" "We're going to do more than that," Harrison replied, a determined glint in his eyes. "We're going to end all of this. Today." It was then that Helen realized, Harrison hadn't just been removed from the case. He had positioned himself strategically, building a network of allies and gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to act. "Why are you telling me all this?" Helen asked, still cautious despite the relief she felt. Harrison smiled sadly. "Because Mike Sullivan trusted you. We found your notes about your work after the accident. He believed that, despite your criticisms of the system, you were someone who truly cared about the truth." He grabbed his coat, checking his service weapon. "Besides, you're here, aren't you? Risking your life for a soldier you probably would have disregarded 2 days ago. That says a lot about your character." A phone rang, one of Harrison's contacts confirming positions. The colonel listened intently, jotting down quick notes. "They're holding Anderson at the warehouse as we suspected," he reported. "But there's more. We've just intercepted communications indicating they plan to resolve the problem permanently tonight. We can't wait." Helen felt her stomach twist. "What can we do?" "You're going to help us get in," Harrison said, surprising her. "They're expecting you to show up alone with the documents. That will give us the distraction we need." "But what if something goes wrong?" Harrison looked her in the eye. "Dr. Matthews, sometimes we have to risk everything for the truth. Isn't that what you've spent years teaching your students?" The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Helen. Her entire career had been built on criticizing militarism and the us versus them mentality. Now she was about to take part in a rescue operation alongside the very military personnel she had judged so harshly for so long. "I'll do it," she said finally. "What do you need me to do?" The sun was beginning to set as Helen drove to the abandoned warehouse, following the instructions she had received. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. On the passenger seat, a folder full of documents, not the originals but convincing copies that Harrison had quickly prepared. "Keep the car moving slowly," Harrison's voice came through the small earpiece she was wearing. "Let them guide you where they want. We need them to focus on you." Helen took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremble in her hands as she steered the vehicle. Two men emerged from the shadows, signaling for her to stop near a side entrance of the warehouse. "Documents," one of them demanded as she stepped out of the car, her hands raised as instructed. "First, I want to see Anderson," Helen replied, her voice firmer than she expected. The taller man gave an unpleasant smile. "You're not in a position to make demands, Professor. But don't worry, you'll be joining him soon enough." The implications of the threat made Helen shiver, but she kept her composure. Harrison had explained that they needed to buy time. His men were silently positioning themselves around the warehouse, using the growing darkness as cover. The men led her into the building. The space was vast and poorly lit, with old industrial machines casting distorted shadows on the walls. The smell of mold and abandonment was overpowering. "Helen?" Anderson's weak voice came from a dark corner. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, Helen saw him tied to a metal chair. His face was battered, a trickle of dried blood running from his temple, but his eyes still held the same determination she'd come to admire. "I told you not to come," he murmured, trying to smile despite the evident pain. Silence. A third man emerged from the shadows. Unlike the others, he wore a military uniform with the insignia of a colonel. "Now, Dr. Matthews, the documents, please." Helen extended the folder with the copies, her heart racing. Everything depended on the next few minutes. "Colonel Bradley," she said, recognizing him from the photos in Mike's files. Finally meeting the man behind the scheme. Bradley skimmed through the documents quickly, his eyes narrowing. "Impressive collection. I imagine there are copies." "In secure locations," Helen replied, buying time. "Important people already have access to everything." "Lies," Bradley growled. "You wouldn't have had time. Since we captured Anderson this morning, you've been too busy trying to find him." He gestured to his men. "Finish this. No witnesses. Are you sure you want to do this, Marcus?" Harrison's voice echoed through the warehouse, making everyone turn. He was standing near the entrance, his gun pointed firmly at Bradley. "Richard," Bradley practically spat the name. "I should have known you were involved in this. Always trying to be the hero." "No," Harrison responded calmly, taking a step forward. "Always trying to do the right thing. Just like Mike Sullivan was trying to do." One of Bradley's men started to move, but Harrison was faster. "I wouldn't do that. My men have the entire perimeter covered." "It's over, Marcus." Bradley laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Over? You don't understand, Richard. This is much bigger than you think. Powerful people depend on this system. One phone call and all your phone calls have been blocked," a new voice announced. Sarah Jenkins emerged from another entrance, holding her phone like a weapon. "And every word of this conversation is being broadcast live to multiple newsrooms." "Game over, Colonel." Bradley's face contorted into a mask of rage. In one swift motion he drew a gun, aiming it at Anderson. "No one's going to." The sound of the shot echoed through the warehouse before he could finish the sentence. Bradley staggered back, his gun falling to the ground as he clutched his wounded shoulder. Harrison had been faster. Within seconds, the warehouse was filled with armed agents, Harrison's team emerging from various positions. Bradley's men, realizing they were at a disadvantage, lowered their weapons. Helen rushed to Anderson, her hands trembling as she tried to untie him. "Are you okay? We need a medic here." "I'm fine," he muttered, though his pale face told a different story. "How?" "We'll explain everything later," she replied, finally managing to free the ropes. "For now, we need to take care of you." As medics, whom Harrison had positioned as a precaution, entered the warehouse, Sarah approached Helen. "We've got everything on tape. The evidence, Bradley's confession, the attempted murder. This is going to explode like a bomb." "And the original documents?" "Safe," Sarah smiled. "And already being analyzed by a team of investigative journalists. The story airs tomorrow on multiple outlets simultaneously. There's no way to cover this up." Helen watched as Bradley and his men were handcuffed and escorted away under heavy guard. Harrison approached, holstering his gun. "Good work, Dr. Matthews," he said. "Mike was right about you." "About a lot of things," she replied, looking at Anderson, who was being attended to by the medics. "I spent so much time judging people by the uniforms they wore, I almost lost sight of their humanity." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes we need a wake-up call to realize that the world isn't just black and white. There are good and bad elements in every institution. And heroes in the most unlikely places," Helen added, thinking about how her life had completely changed in just 2 days. Anderson was being prepped for transport to the hospital, but insisted on speaking with Helen first. "Thank you," he said, holding her hand. "For risking everything to help me. For believing in me." Helen felt tears welling up in her eyes. "No, David. I should be thanking you. You and Mike, you taught me more about courage, integrity, and true service than all my years in academia." As the wail of police sirens filled the night, Helen knew nothing would ever be the same. Her worldview had been irrevocably changed, not by theories or books, but by raw reality and the courage of those who risked everything for the truth. The helicopter case, as it would come to be known, exploded across the national media the following morning. The story of corruption, death, and courage captivated the entire country. But for Helen, the real story was more personal. It was about broken prejudices, lessons learned, and the discovery that heroism and integrity don't wear uniforms. 6 months later, the main auditorium at the university was packed. Helen Matthews stood on stage, but not to give her usual lecture on the militarization of society. This time it was different. "When I boarded that plane 6 months ago," she began, her voice carrying a new depth, "I thought I had all the answers. 20 years of academic research had convinced me I understood military institutions and the people who served in them. I was completely wrong." In the front row, David Anderson smiled quietly. Though he still used a cane to help with mobility, his physical and emotional recovery was remarkable. Beside him, Sarah Jenkins was taking notes. She was finishing a book about the case. The helicopter scandal, as it came to be known, exposed a network of corruption that cost precious lives, Helen continued. But it also revealed something equally important: the extraordinary courage of ordinary people who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. The investigations had led to more than 30 arrests, including high-ranking officers and executives from maintenance companies. Colonel Bradley had made a plea deal, exposing the entire scheme in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the real impact of the case went far beyond the legal consequences. "Michael Sullivan didn't die in vain," Helen said, her voice breaking slightly. "His determination to expose the truth, even knowing the risks, inspired others to follow his example. Today, there are new safety and transparency protocols in place at military bases across the country." In the audience, Sarah Sullivan, Mike's mother, discreetly wiped away a tear. Beside her, Colonel Harrison held his military posture, but his eyes revealed the pride he felt for what they had achieved. "But this isn't just a story about corruption and justice," Helen continued. "It's a story about prejudices and how they blind us to the true nature of people. It's about learning that heroism and integrity can't be judged by the clothes someone wears or the institution they belong to." Anderson shifted in his seat, remembering that first encounter on the plane. So much had changed since then. After his recovery, he had been promoted and was now working on developing new safety protocols, using his experience to prevent other tragedies from occurring. "As an academic," Helen went on, "I spent years teaching my students to question institutions and structures of power. That's still important. But now I understand that criticism without empathy, analysis without human understanding, can be just as dangerous as the blind conformity we used to condemn." She paused, looking at the attentive faces in front of her. Many were her former students, who had watched her transformation with a mix of surprise and admiration. "True change," she continued, "rarely comes from grand gestures or abstract theories. It comes from people like Mike Sullivan, who risked everything for the truth. Like David Anderson, who carried on his friend's fight despite the personal consequences. Like Sarah Jenkins, who used her journalistic work not for sensationalism, but for justice." In the audience, several retired military officers, part of Harrison's network, nodded in approval. They had become unlikely allies on this journey, each contributing their part to expose the truth. "Today I'm not here to give a lecture," Helen said, her voice growing softer. "I'm here to share a lesson I learned the hard way, that hasty judgments and prejudices can keep us from seeing the true essence of people. That sometimes our greatest teachers are those we initially consider our adversaries." She looked directly at Anderson, a silent moment of understanding passing between them. That first conversation on the plane had changed them both profoundly. The legacy of Mike Sullivan lives not only in the institutional changes his sacrifice brought about, but in each of us who learn to look beyond appearances, to question not only others but also our own certainties. When Helen finished her speech, the auditorium erupted in applause. Anderson was the first to stand, followed by Harrison and gradually the entire audience. It was more than an ovation, it was a recognition of a universal truth that everyone there had learned. After the speech, as people began to disperse, Helen found Anderson near the stage. "It's still strange to hear my story told like this," he said with a soft smile. Our story, Helen corrected. A story that needs to keep being told? Sarah Jenkins approached, her notebook in hand. The book is almost ready. Do you two want to read the final draft? Of course, Anderson replied. Although the best part of the story can't be fully captured in words. What part? Helen asked. The transformation, he said simply. How a chance encounter on a plane can completely change the way we see the world. Helen smiled, thinking about how her life had changed in the past 6 months. Her next lecture would be at the military academy, a request she would have automatically declined in the past, but now saw as an opportunity to build bridges of understanding. You know, she said, I think Mike would be proud. Not just because the truth was exposed, but because his story keeps inspiring people to look beyond their own preconceptions. Anderson nodded, subconsciously touching the dog tags he still carried. His and Mike's, a constant reminder of the price and value of truth. As they walked together out of the auditorium, Helen reflected on how life has surprising ways of teaching us its most important lessons. Sometimes we need to lose our certainties to find the truth. And sometimes, it's precisely those we hastily judge who end up showing us the path to a deeper, more human understanding of the world. Friends, what did you think of this story of transformation and discovery? How would you react if you were in Helen's shoes, having to question everything you believed in? Or in Anderson's position, having to trust someone who initially judged you so harshly? Share your thoughts in the comments. We love reading different perspectives and creating meaningful dialogues with you. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Every like and subscription helps us reach more people with deep, transformative stories like this one. Also, hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exciting stories. We'll see you in the next story, where once again we'll dive into narratives that make us question, reflect, and grow. Until then.